I want to show you two headlines. Same day, same events, same facts, but different media outlets. I'll give you a moment to read it. Everybody got that? What if I told you that how you felt reading those two, the flash of reaction, the instinctive lean towards one or another, wasn't your logic? That was language doing something to your brain before you even had the chance to think. And here's the uncomfortable part. That happens to us every single day, on your phone, in your feed, in every single room you walk into. The question isn't whether or not language influences you. The question is, do you ever notice when it does? We have this assumption, this very human assumption that our thoughts are our own, that we observe the world, process it rationally, and form our own conclusions. It's a natural cycle of thought. But here's where science says, language gets there first. Cognitive linguist Lara Berditsky from Stanford University ran a series of experiments testing how language shapes the way someone thinks. In one study, she found out that Mandarin speakers use vertical lines to actually talk about time. 上 and 下 means up and down. But when referring to time, 上 means earlier, 下 means later. So when we're saying 上年, we're not saying up year, we're saying last year. English speakers, however, we talk about time horizontally. We put the past behind us. We look forward to things. And when measured, Mandarin speakers responded to time and questions faster when time was presented in a vertical way. Same concept, different language, and literally different cognitive pathways. And then Daniel Kahneman comes into the picture. His framework of System 1 and System 2 tells us that our brain has two modes. System 2, that's your slow, your deliberate, your analytical mind, the one that we think we're using when we're forming opinions. But System 1 is fast, it's automatic, it's emotional. And here's the secret. It responds to language even before System 2 has a chance to wake up. System 1 doesn't ask, is this framing fair? It asks, does this feel right? And language already decides what feels right. So, here's the idea that I want you to sit with today. We've been taught to worry about misinformation, about things that are factually wrong. And that's a real problem. But I think there's something happening beneath it, something that is more subtle. It's not the lies we should fear the most, it's the framing. Because framing doesn't give you false information. It gives you true information. But that true information is wrapped in language that triggers your emotions, activates your identity, and bypasses your logic. And that can honestly be more dangerous if we don't notice it. This is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, what linguists call linguistic relativity. But for years, it was close to linguistic determinism, which basically implies that humans are not capable of forming their own thoughts without language. And for decades, this was controversial. Was it too strong? Too deterministic? But then Lara Berditsky's research gave us something far more nuanced. Language doesn't determine everything, but language nudges thought. It has the ability to bias what you see, what you remember, and what feels true. And in 2026, in the age of algorithmic media, political polarization, and dizzying 24-hour news cycle, that nudge has become something stronger. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as it's being described to you. So, here's what I want you to understand about how language and perception interact. Words don't arrive after thought. They shape thought as it is forming. Think about how we talk about the war. When the US launched strikes in Iran in February 2026, American officials didn't say, oh, we attacked Iran. They said we were neutralizing combat power. The same event, same strike, Iranian state media called it a massacre of civilians. remembered the headlines you read. But the subtler version is the one hiding in plain sight, because journalists covering the same event now had to choose. Was it a strike or an attack? Were civilians killed, or were they casualties of a military operation? Those aren't synonyms, because strike sounds surgical. Attack feels like aggression. Casualties abstracts human death into mere political tactic. Killing makes it personal. This is exactly what Paul Thibodeau and Lara Borditsky's research on metaphor and framing demonstrates. Words that you encounter don't just influence your thought, but it anchors your entire subsequent reasoning. It sets the stage, and everything that comes afterwards is filtered through that frame. And let me be honest about something personal. I consume a lot of news from social media, Instagram, X, YouTube. I grew up thinking that it was a good thing, that staying informed meant staying objective. But somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just absorbing information, I was absorbing vocabulary. The feeds I followed started giving me specific sets of words for the world. Certain phrases became familiar, and others started to feel foreign, even offensive. Not because the ideas were wrong, but because the words were unfamiliar to me. Depending on which accounts I followed, the same military operation was either an act of historical deterrence or an act of terror. The same dead civilians were either martyrs or collateral damage. And after weeks of scrolling, certain words just started feeling right, and others started to feel like propaganda. That is not thinking. That is conditioning. And Kahneman would say that's exactly System 1 talking, because familiarity feels like truth, and repetition feels like evidence. This is how echo chambers really work. We talk about them as information bubbles, facts circulating in a room. But in reality, it's much deeper than that. Echo chambers are linguistic realities. Words like virtue signaling, lip-tard, sane-washed, those are tribal language. And here's the thing about tribal language. It doesn't just identify who you are. It excludes those who don't speak it. It draws a border that's not around ideas, but around words. Linguists call this linguistic divergence. It's when language becomes highly internalized and specialized, when a group of people only spend most of their time talking to each other with the same vocabulary. Foucault argued that language had never been neutral. It had always been a system of power. The words that are acceptable or unacceptable in a given space tell you everything about who holds authority in that space. So when political correctness enters the room, we're not just policing offensiveness. We're having a real fight about whose vocabulary gets to define reality. The terms undocumented immigrants and illegal aliens literally describe the same human beings, but with a completely different moral universe constructed around them. And now, there's one more layer shaping all of this, the algorithm. Because the algorithm doesn't decide what's true, it decides what to amplify. And what does it amplify? Content that gets engagement, content that triggers your System 1, content that makes you angry, afraid, euphoric. Because that content works, because it's emotionally loaded, it's linguistically charged, and it's deeply familiar to your existing vocabulary. And that gets all the engagement they need. So your feed isn't really a window to the world. It's more like a mirror that constantly reflects your own words back at you. And it reflects louder each time. I remember when news stories felt heavy and important. And then I noticed something. They stopped feeling heavy and important. Not because the events were less serious, but because something has changed. Because we have been exposed to so much emotionally amplified language that our baseline has shifted. We call this desensitization. I call it what it actually is. Your emotional vocabulary has been inflated. The language of crisis has become so hyperbolically common that a real crisis gets lost in the noise. Media outlets know this, and it becomes the race to the bottom. If neutral language doesn't hold your attention, escalate. If conflict doesn't work, say war. If disagreement doesn't land, say attack. Not because it's accurate, but because the content that triggers your system one works. It gets the algorithmic reach. You share, you like, you repost, and you sitting there doom scrolling, you're not in system 2 territory, you're in maximum system 1. And you're in your minimum cognitive resistance to actually be critical. And that is when language is hitting you at your hardest, at your lowest defense. So, here's what's at stake if we don't take this seriously. We are living through a period of catastrophic political polarization. See what I did there? Not because people have fundamentally incompatible values, but because people have been living in incompatible linguistic realities. Because people can look at the same protest, the same policy, the same human beings, and see two completely different things. Not because one is smarter, not because one is more informed, but because they've been living in different language environments, and they have been quietly installing a cognitive software. And when we don't have shared language, we don't just disagree. We stop being able to talk. We stop being able to reason together. And a democracy that can't reason together isn't really a democracy at all. We become competing loudspeakers. The most powerful code controlling your life is the language you don't even notice. And right now, that code is being written by media corporations with engagement metrics, algorithms with no conscience, and politicians who knows which words flip your nervous system. The question is not whether or not this is happening to you. It is. The question is, are you going to be aware of it? So, what do we do? What do we actually do in this scenario? Not consume less media, because that's avoidance, that's awareness, especially now in the digital age. Not fun, unbiased sources, because framing is not the bias, it's the structure of all communication. It's inevitable. Here's what I think actually helps. First, name the frame before you absorb the content. When you read a headline or a news article, ask not is this true, but what word choices were being made here? Take a look at the adverbs or the adjectives they use to describe a specific event. What emotional state does that actually put me in? Linguists call this meta-linguistic awareness. It's where you think about language before you absorb it. I call it reading with your eyes actually open. Second, actively seek vocabulary from outside your echo chamber. Cross the border. Not to be influenced, not to be manipulated, but to understand the linguistic logic of perspectives that feel alien to you. Because if you can't understand how someone thinks, not just what they think, then you can't actually engage with them. You're just yelling past each other. And third, this is the hardest one. Notice when a word feels wrong to you. Not factually wrong, emotionally wrong, uncomfortable, unfamiliar. Because that discomfort, that is system one protecting you from your existing vocabulary, from actual challenge. That is the algorithm working on you. That discomfort is exactly the place you need to grow, only if you let it. So, your thoughts are not entirely your own, but they never were. They are shaped by every single word you've absorbed, from something you've read from a Facebook page, a news article, from a school textbook. Every word your parents have said, that has shaped you. But that is nothing to be ashamed of. That makes us human. But it is something to be awake to. Because once you start seeing the code, you can start writing some of it yourself. Thank you.